It began like any other vacation at sea. Bright sunlight on polished decks, the faint smell of salt and sunscreen, the soft hum of engines pushing a floating city through calm Gulf waters. Thousands of passengers boarded with excitement that Saturday morning, unaware that within 24 hours they would become part of one of the most talked about voyages in modern cruise history. For most of them, it was meant to be an easy getaway, 4 nights of warmth, music, and open horizon. They had no reason to expect anything else. The ship itself was a marvel of engineering and hospitality: 13 decks, swimming pools, theaters, a casino, and endless buffets. Crew members greeted families at the gangway, cameras flashed, and a familiar rhythm took hold. The shuffle of sandals on deck, the laughter of people exploring their temporary home. As evening settled and the coast disappeared behind them, the captain's voice came over the public address system welcoming everyone aboard, promising smooth sailing toward the Yucatan Peninsula. Applause filled the lounges. Someone raised a glass to the first night at sea. Early the next morning, breakfast lines formed, children darted between tables, and the crew moved efficiently through routines honed by repetition. Deep inside the lower decks, engineers monitored instruments and listened to the steady pulse of the engines. Everything looked normal until a few minutes after 10, when an indicator on one of the control panels blinked amber, then red. A sharp smell, electrical, acrid, began to drift through a corridor few passengers ever saw. One crew member, later interviewed, recalled it this way: "At first we thought it was just an overheated cable. Then the alarm sounded, and we knew it was serious." In the engine room, the team moved fast, following procedures drilled into them through countless safety exercises. But the situation escalated. Sparks lipped, insulation smoldered, and within moments, smoke filled the confined space. Automatic systems triggered, sealing sections to contain the fire. Up on the passenger decks, most people didn't know anything was wrong. The ship barely trembled. A few noticed a sudden drop in background noise, the subtle thrum of machinery fading into silence. Then lights flickered. Elevators stopped between floors. Air conditioning fans slowed and went quiet. Within minutes, the intercom crackled to life, a calm announcement, rehearsed and careful, instructing passengers to remain where they were while engineers addressed a technical issue. The word "fire" was never used at that stage, but whispers spread quickly. Crew hurried through corridors carrying radios and flashlights. Some passengers gathered on open decks, pointing toward a plume of gray smoke rising from the ship's funnel. Phones appeared. Videos were recorded. Most assumed it was minor, something that would be fixed before lunch. Below, engineers fought to control the blaze. Sprinklers and extinguishers did their work, and by early afternoon the flames were out, but the damage was done. Electrical systems had been crippled, propulsion disabled, and the ship was adrift, more than 100 miles from the nearest port. Backup generators kicked in for essential functions, but full power was gone. Communication lines were limited to satellite phones and emergency radios. The captain's next announcement carried a different tone, still calm, but firmer, slower. He explained that an engine room fire had forced a shutdown and that the ship would await assistance. He assured passengers everyone was safe and that tugboats were being dispatched. On deck, people clapped with relief. They trusted the professionals in charge. Hours passed. The sun dipped low over the horizon. Without propulsion, the ship turned with the wind, gently but unpredictably. Air conditioning remained off. Cabins grew warm and still. Dinner service was replaced by sandwiches and bottled water distributed by smiling crew members doing their best to keep spirits high. The entertainment staff played music near the pool. Children danced. Parents tried to laugh along. The sense of adventure wasn't gone yet. Most believed they'd be towed back to port overnight. But as darkness thickened, so did uncertainty. The breeze carried the smell of smoke mixed with fuel oil that lingered from the earlier fire. Emergency lights bathed hallways in dim orange. Elevators remained out, forcing passengers to use narrow stairwells lit by flashlights. The crew continued reassuring everyone, but questions multiplied. How far were the tugboats? Would the toilets work? What about refrigeration for food? A passenger remembered later. We tried to stay positive. The crew handed out playing cards, and people shared stories. But when the lights kept flickering, we started realizing this wasn't going to be quick. By midnight, the first reports confirmed that tugboats were still hundreds of miles away. Weather remained calm, but the Gulf's vastness pressed on the senses. Nothing but black water in every direction, stars brighter than anyone had seen before. Satellite phones crackled with updates to headquarters on shore. Engineers tried rerouting power, but each attempt failed. The electrical grid was too damaged. Refrigerators shut down, elevators remained dead, and the sewage system began to strain. On the bridge, Officers plotted drift patterns and maintained radio contact with Coast Guard vessels. They knew the ship was safe for now, stable, no flooding, no injuries. But comfort was rapidly deteriorating. The challenge shifted from technical recovery to humanitarian endurance. Thousands of people suddenly found themselves on a powerless city in the middle of the Gulf. Morning brought heat. Without functioning ventilation, cabins felt stifling. Many passengers slept on open decks, wrapped in towels or life vest cushions. Crew distributed breakfast using limited supplies: cold bread, fruit, and water. Everyone queued patiently at first. There was humor in adversity. Someone joked that it felt like camping at sea. Laughter rippled through the line. But beneath the jokes, anxiety grew. The captain continued regular announcements, promising assistance was on the way, thanking passengers for cooperation, emphasizing that safety was not at risk. And it wasn't. Not in the immediate sense. The hull was intact, the weather good. Yet being stranded in motionless water with dwindling resources produced a subtle unease that built hour by hour. By the second day, the ship's list toward one side became noticeable as wind pushed against it. Crew worked to balance ballast tanks manually. Portable generators provided limited power for essential medical equipment and lighting in critical areas. The crew's resourcefulness impressed many passengers. Others began to realize the scale of what had happened. From the deck, they could see the trail of smoke marks still staining the funnel, a reminder of how suddenly plans can change at sea. Cell service flashes came and went. When someone managed to send a text or photo home, it spread quickly online. News outlets picked up the story: a cruise liner adrift in the Gulf after a fire, awaiting tow. Families ashore watched television footage showing their loved ones waving from the rails. Inside, conditions slowly worsened. Without refrigeration, food choices narrowed. Lines for meals stretched long, patients shorter. Toilets, dependent on power, stopped functioning in most cabins, forcing the crew to improvise cleaning systems and set up designated facilities. These were uncomfortable realities, handled with as much dignity as possible. But passengers began counting the days. A woman later described the feeling. There was nowhere to go, nothing to do but wait. The ocean was calm, but you felt trapped by it. You'd look out and see beauty, sunlight on the water. And at the same time you'd think, please, let's move. Still, people adapted. Crew members organized deck games to distract children. Friends formed among strangers. Shared experience turned frustration into solidarity. They were safe after all, and that fact mattered most. Evenings were surreal. With little artificial light, the ship glowed faintly against the horizon, a silent shape under countless stars. The soundscape changed. Instead of engine vibration, only the whisper of waves against metal hull. Some found it hauntingly peaceful, others unsettling. The ocean was vast, indifferent, magnificent. The second night ended with hope. A message from the bridge that the first tugboat was approaching by morning. Applause echoed through corridors. People cheered from balconies when they spotted faint lights in the distance. For the first time since the fire, there was a sense of progress, of connection to the world beyond the water. Crew worked through the night preparing tow cables and checking structural points. They were professionals who had trained for emergencies but rarely faced one of this duration. They moved with quiet focus, knowing the eyes of hundreds watched them from decks above. One engineer recalled later, "You don't think about the cameras. You just think, keep it stable, keep people calm, and get everyone home." As dawn approached, the sea turned silver under rising light, and the faint hum of an approaching vessel became audible. Relief spread through the ship like a collective breath. People leaned over rails, waving at the tiny silhouette that represented rescue. For a moment, morale soared. They believed the ordeal would soon end. They didn't yet know that towing a powerless cruise ship across the Gulf would be far slower than anyone imagined. The tug arrived at dawn, a small but powerful workboat that looked impossibly tiny beside the cruise liner's towering hull. Crew on both vessels exchanged signals, thick tow lines were secured, and a slow tension built in the cables until they hummed under strain. On deck, passengers applauded when they felt the first gentle pull. The ship began to move, barely perceptible at first, then steadily, a reassuring motion after 2 days of drifting. It felt like salvation, but the Gulf of Mexico is wide, and towing a vessel of that size at only a few knots meant the journey home would take days, not hours. The tug's engines labored. Radio chatter confirmed additional assistance was being sent from nearby ports. For now, one line of connection bound the two ships together, stretching across miles of quiet water. The captain addressed everyone once more, his voice clear but cautious. He thanked passengers for their patience, praised the crew's professionalism, and explained that progress would be slow but steady. People listened from lounge chairs and stairwells, fanning themselves against the heat. hope mixed with fatigue. By mid-morning the sun was relentless. Without functioning air systems, shaded spots became valuable territory. Crew handed out cold drinks from portable coolers packed with what ice remained. Passengers shared folding chairs and joked about reserving real estate. Near the railings where sea breeze offered relief, a spirit of cooperation persisted. Strangers traded snacks, helped elderly travelers climb stairs, and watched each other's kids. The hum of the tugboat carried through the hull, a reminder that movement, however slight, continued. Every mile gained felt like progress. But the lack of full power meant no refrigeration for food and limited sanitation. Crews worked constantly to maintain hygiene and morale, a task as demanding as any technical repair. News helicopters appeared overhead by the second afternoon, circling at a respectful distance. Some passengers waved, others turned away, wary of cameras. They wanted privacy as much as rescue. Reports broadcast to the world spoke of a cruise ship, stranded and crippled. Phrases that made the people on board feel both exposed and misunderstood. They weren't helpless, just waiting. A crew supervisor later said, "Our biggest job wasn't fixing machines. It was keeping calm human energy in a metal box floating in the sun." They set up extra water stations, organized cleanup rotations, and checked on vulnerable passengers. The ship's medical team worked tirelessly, ensuring that medication schedules were maintained even without refrigeration. At night, the horizon flickered with distant lightning. Weather forecasts warned of shifting winds, but the sea remained manageable. Still, each gust reminded everyone how fragile their stability was. A passenger remembered standing at the railing, feeling the ship sway slightly as cables tightened and released. You realized how small we all were out there. That tugboat was our only lifeline. The third day began with an unwelcome surprise. A mechanical issue on the tug reduced its towing speed even further. Headquarters ordered additional tugs to rendezvous and share the load, but coordinating them across hundreds of miles of open water took time. The ship slowed almost to a drift again. On deck, the mood wavered. Food supplies were carefully rationed. Crew converted parts of the main dining room into a storage and distribution center, operating like a relief mission. Bread, fruit, and simple meals replaced the elaborate buffets passengers had enjoyed days earlier. Lines stretched across the promenade deck. Volunteers among the guests helped organize queues and deliver meals to cabins. That cooperation prevented chaos even in discomfort. There was a sense of order. Humor resurfaced at odd moments. Someone strummed a guitar, singing improvised verses about the world's slowest cruise. Applause and laughter rippled through the crowd. Small acts like that carried enormous weight, proof that morale could survive isolation. Communication with the outside world was limited to short satellite updates, but eventually, messages confirmed the convoy of tugs was nearing. When the additional vessels arrived, cheers echoed across the decks once more. Their combined power nudged the crippled liner toward the northwest, aiming for the nearest capable port. Behind the scenes, the bridge team calculated drift, weather, and fuel for the tugs. The captain rarely left his post. Officers rotated rest breaks, drinking lukewarm coffee from thermoses, tracking every mile of progress. They knew thousands were relying on their calm. Below, engineers monitored remaining systems. Ventilation fans ran intermittently using portable generators. Temporary lighting illuminated stairwells. The smell of diesel from the tugboats mingled with the ocean air. It wasn't pleasant, but it was movement, proof of progress. By evening, the coastline was still far beyond the horizon. Stars reappeared, and with them a new pattern of routine dinner line, cleanup, outdoor sleeping arrangements, brief announcements, then darkness. People adjusted. One parent described the sight of children sleeping under the open sky on deck chairs as strangely peaceful. They thought it was an adventure. That helped the rest of us keep perspective. The fourth day tested endurance. Heat, limited food variety, and the strain of waiting wore on everyone. Yet discipline held. Crew members, despite exhaustion, maintained professionalism. Many passengers expressed gratitude directly, shaking hands, offering thank you notes written on napkins. Bonds formed that would last long after the voyage ended. Midday brought a faint shimmer on the horizon. Seabirds, then a smudge of land barely visible through haze. Word spread quickly. They were approaching the coastline of the United States. Cheers erupted. Some cried quietly, overwhelmed by relief. The ship was still many hours from port, but sighting land changed everything. Helicopters returned, this time carrying supplies dropped by harness food, bottled water, and messages from corporate officials. Crew retrieved the packages, distributing goods as passengers applauded. The gesture lifted morale again. Cameras captured the moment, symbolic of connection restored. Radio chatter increased as Coast Guard escorts approached. Regulations required inspections before entering port, and tug crews coordinated carefully to prevent line strain. It was complex, slow work. The captain's announcements became more frequent now, counting down distance in nautical miles. Each number drew louder applause. One crew engineer recalled the strange rhythm of those final hours. You're so tired you stop feeling tired. You just focus on getting it done. Every turn of the propeller on those tugs felt like a small victory. Night fell again before they reached port limits. Navigation lights from shore glimmered in the distance, tantalizingly close. The smell of land, a faint earthy undertone carried by the wind, reached those on deck. Cameras clicked, capturing the glow on the horizon. After days of emptiness, the sight of civilization felt surreal. But docking a disabled ship of that size required precision and daylight. Authorities instructed the convoy to anchor offshore until morning. Disappointment rippled through the crowd, but understanding followed. Safety came first. People settled into another restless night, knowing it would be the last one at sea. Early dawn turned the sky pale gold. Tugs adjusted position, cables tightened, and the slow, careful tow toward the harbor began. Passengers lined the rails, some wrapped in blankets, others waving flags improvised from towels. Reporters waited on shore. Rescue teams and company representatives stood ready. The final miles felt eternal. Then, after nearly 5 days adrift, the ship eased alongside the dock. Cheers erupted, wild, cathartic, unstoppable. Crew members wept quietly. Passengers hugged one another. Gangways were positioned, and disembarkation began under supervision of safety officers. Many paused before stepping onto solid ground, taking in the surreal relief of stability. Authorities conducted medical checks. Buses waited to carry travelers onward. Despite exhaustion, most people expressed gratitude rather than anger. They understood the risks of the sea, and they had seen professionalism in crisis. The crew received applause as they left the ship last, a rare reversal of ceremony that spoke volumes about shared endurance. When the final passenger disembarked, the once silent engine's bay echoed with technicians assessing damage. The investigation would later trace the fire to a fuel line leak that ignited insulation materials, an event swift and destructive, but contained thanks to safety systems. No lives were lost. Back on shore, interviews captured a spectrum of reactions: frustration, relief, humor, disbelief. But a common thread ran through every account: respect for how people had adapted. The experience had stripped away luxury and left only cooperation, patience, and gratitude. In the days that followed, the image of that massive cruise ship being towed into port circled the globe. News anchors replayed footage of wary passengers wrapped in blankets, waving from balconies as tugs guided them through murky water toward shore. It was both a triumph of survival and a humbling reminder of how vulnerable even the most advanced machines can be when nature and circumstance combine. The ship's arrival sparked a media frenzy. Satellite trucks lined to port. Reporters broadcast live updates, calling it everything from the cruise from hell to modern-day maritime ordeal. Passengers were interviewed as they stepped off buses and into waiting terminals. Some smiled through exhaustion, insisting the crew had done their best. Others spoke candidly about the discomfort and uncertainty, about the heat, the smell, and the helplessness of being adrift without power. But what struck many observers was how calm most passengers appeared. Despite days of hardship, there were no injuries, no panic, and no violence, just patience tested to its limits. The company quickly arranged accommodations, transportation home, and refunds for every traveler. They also offered credits toward future cruises, though not everyone was ready to set foot on another ship anytime soon. Behind the scenes, the investigation began immediately. Teams from maritime authorities, insurance groups, and the cruise line's own engineering division boarded the vessel to document damage. The engine room, once filled with smoke and fire, was now a scene of meticulous examination. Charred metal, melted wiring, heat-scorched insulation. The cause was soon identified: a failure in a fuel line that allowed oil to spray onto a hot surface, igniting a blaze that spread faster than containment systems could fully stop it. While safety protocols had prevented tragedy, the event exposed a weakness in redundancy systems: how quickly a single failure could cascade into a full power loss. Maritime regulators took note. Within months, new guidelines for generator placement and fire containment were proposed across the industry. The Carnival Triumph became a case study used in training centers worldwide, a reminder that complacency at sea can be costly. For passengers, the experience lingered in memory long after the story faded from headlines. Interviews and documentaries captured small details the public never saw. Handwritten thank you notes slipped under cabin doors for crew members who had gone above and beyond. Passengers who organized informal cleanup teams, strangers who stayed in touch afterward, bound by shared adversity. One woman later said, "I went on that ship as a tourist, but I came off feeling like part of a crew." Her words echoed a sentiment repeated often that crisis reveals character, both individual and collective. On board, engineers faced months of repairs. The ship was dry-docked, gutted, and rebuilt with new safety systems. Redesign efforts included improved insulation, separated electrical zones, and reinforced backup generators. When it finally returned to service, it did so under a new name and a cloud of scrutiny, but also as a symbol of resilience. Meanwhile, the wider cruise industry took a hard look at itself. Companies invested in upgraded emergency power systems capable of running essential services even if primary engines failed. They reviewed evacuation and communication protocols, ensuring passengers would receive clearer updates during crisis. And perhaps most importantly, they emphasized training, drills not just for fire or flood, but for prolonged loss of comfort and convenience. Maritime academies added case studies of the Triumph incident to their curriculums. Analysts dissected every phase: the ignition, containment, drift, rescue, and recovery. For students, it became a lesson in systems thinking, how a luxury vessel designed for pleasure must still be prepared for hardship. In the months that followed, public fascination with the story persisted. Documentaries aired, each framing the incident through a different lens: engineering, human endurance, corporate accountability. Internet forums debated whether modern cruising had become too complacent, relying too heavily on technology without enough backup. Others pointed out that the very fact everyone returned safely proved the strength of existing safety culture. For the passengers, returning to everyday life wasn't simple. Many described lingering unease around enclosed spaces or mechanical noises. Some avoided elevators or confined rooms for weeks. Others booked another cruise almost immediately, determined not to let fear define the experience. Psychologists who studied disaster resilience noted how group support on board had prevented panic. Shared laughter, music, and mutual care had preserved mental stability, even when conditions deteriorated physically. A crew member recalled in an interview, "We didn't think of ourselves as heroes. We just followed training. But seeing passengers smile when we handed out water in the dark, that's something I'll never forget." The company's leadership faced hearings and questions about maintenance schedules and fuel line inspections. Transparency became a focus. Officials released reports publicly, acknowledging faults and detailing improvements. This openness, though uncomfortable, helped rebuild trust. As months passed, a new narrative replaced the old one. The story was no longer just about discomfort at sea. It became about adaptation, teamwork, and lessons learned. The term, Triumph, took on a different meaning, one of endurance rather than luxury. Industry analysts noted measurable effects. Booking patterns dipped temporarily, but the downturn was short-lived. Travelers are resilient, and the allure of the ocean endures. By the next season, cruise lines were once again near full capacity. The difference lay in preparation. Ships now carried additional generators, better redundancy, and updated passenger briefings. A maritime safety officer summed it up: "The ocean doesn't forgive assumptions." What happened on that ship reminded us that every voyage is a responsibility. For those who had been there, however, the experience remained personal. Many kept photos not as souvenirs of disaster, but as reminders of perspective, how easily comfort can vanish and how strength can emerge in its absence. Social media posts from passengers years later often included the same phrase, "We made it home." In the public mind, the story of the Carnival Triumph became a parable. It illustrated how technology can falter, yet human cooperation can sustain hope. It also changed how people viewed cruise vacations, not just as indulgence, but as a delicate balance between engineering, logistics, and the unpredictable forces of nature. At sea, distance and time expand perception. Hours feel longer, space wider. For those 5 days adrift, passengers experienced both the fragility and the majesty of isolation. They saw sunsets uninterrupted by land, stars unpolluted by city lights, and waves that moved endlessly without destination. Some described it as hauntingly beautiful even amid hardship. A retired couple later told interviewers, "It wasn't the cruise we paid for, but it was one we'll never forget. You learn a lot about patience when the only thing to do is wait for the horizon to move." By the 1-year anniversary, the story had softened into reflection. Documentaries revisited the crew, now reassigned to other ships, and passengers who had resumed normal life. They spoke not with bitterness, but with insight. What they remembered most wasn't the smell of smoke or the heat of powerless cabins. It was the kindness, the humor, the shared understanding that everyone was in it together. Even now, maritime students and crisis management professionals study the case as an example of leadership under stress. The captain's measured tone, the crew's discipline, and the passengers' cooperation all contributed to a safe outcome despite adversity. The ship's name may have changed, but its story endures. In maritime museums and training manuals, references to the Triumph incident remind future sailors of the importance of redundancy, preparation, and humility before nature. For travelers who still choose the open sea, it stands as both caution and comfort that while not every voyage goes as planned, resilience can carry a ship further than engines ever could. In the months after the Triumph incident, maritime experts debated logistics and design, but for the people who had lived through it, the conversation felt simpler. It wasn't about systems or blueprints. It was about perspective. Being adrift had stripped life down to its essentials: light, air, food, and the comfort of one another. For many, that simplicity stayed with them long after they stepped onto land. Some passengers said they began noticing small things differently: the hum of an air conditioner, the brightness of a hallway light, the steady rhythm of a refrigerator motor. Things most people never think about suddenly carried meaning. They had learned what it felt like to live without them. One woman, interviewed months later, described standing in her kitchen at home listening to the sound of the dishwasher and realizing it reminded her of the ship. Not the panic, not the smell of smoke, but the sound of routine returning. "You appreciate the ordinary in a way you didn't before," she said. For the crew, the experience became a test of endurance that shaped careers. Many continued working at sea, some even returning to the same vessel after repairs. They spoke of pride in how they had held the line. Not with heroics, but with quiet consistency. They had learned that leadership wasn't always about giving orders. Sometimes it was about staying calm when everything else stopped. One officer reflected, "When the lights went out, people didn't look for an announcement. They looked at us. That's when you realize the job isn't steering the ship. It's being the anchor." In the cruise industry, the Triumph fire became a marker in time, a before and after moment. The lessons weren't limited to engineering. They extended into communication, transparency, and empathy. Cruise lines began sharing more about safety procedures during embarkation, giving passengers a clearer sense of how systems worked. It wasn't about fear. It was about respect for complexity. Public trust gradually rebuilt. New travelers boarded ships that looked and felt the same: gleaming decks, endless buffets, cheerful music. But beneath the surface, things had changed. Backup systems were stronger, emergency training deeper, and awareness sharper. Each voyage carried the quiet influence of those days adrift in the Gulf. Still, the story of being stuck at sea continues to resonate beyond one ship or one year. It touches something universal: the tension between control and surrender. The ocean has always been a mirror of human ambition: vast, unpredictable, beautiful, indifferent. We build ships to master it, yet each journey reminds us that mastery is temporary. When the Triumph drifted powerless across calm waters, it forced everyone aboard to face that paradox. They were surrounded by beauty and isolation at once, trapped, yet safe, powerless, yet together. That contradiction is what makes the story linger. For storytellers, journalists, and everyday travelers, it became shorthand for the thin line between adventure and ordeal. Every cruise promises escape, the chance to leave schedules behind, to float free from responsibility. And yet, that same freedom can turn fragile in a single spark. But there's another side to the story, one that often gets overlooked. While headlines focused on discomfort and inconvenience, the quieter truth was endurance. Thousands of people faced 5 days of uncertainty without panic, without conflict, without giving up hope. That's not chaos. That's resilience. One passenger said later, "It wasn't the ship that made it a nightmare. It was the waiting. Waiting tests everything: patience, kindness, faith. And that's what being at sea does. It stretches time. Every minute expands, every thought echoes longer. The horizon never changes, so your mind turns inward. Out there, surrounded by endless blue, you realize how much of life depends on invisible systems: electricity, engines, communication, and how quickly those systems can vanish. For some, that realization became a kind of meditation. The ocean has no interest in our schedules, no awareness of our discomfort. It simply moves. Day follows night, waves rise and fall, stars appear and disappear. To be stuck at sea is to be reminded that control is an illusion, and that adaptation is our real power. The Triumph incident didn't just change safety codes, it changed the narrative of what a cruise means. It reminded both companies and travelers that the ocean isn't a theme park backdrop. It's alive, beautiful, vast, unpredictable, and always in charge. Even years later, interviews with former passengers often end the same way, with gratitude. Not for the experience itself, but for what it revealed. Gratitude for calm seas when the world felt small. Gratitude for crew members who kept smiling. Gratitude for the moment they saw land again and realized they had made it through. That gratitude echoes in every person who chooses to sail after hearing the story, because whether it's a week of sunshine or an unexpected test of patience, every voyage carries the same truth. At sea, you learn what really matters. The footage from those days still circulates online, people sleeping on deck chairs, waving at helicopters, cheering when tugboats appear. What the camera doesn't capture is the quiet resilience behind those scenes. The small decisions, the shared water bottles, the laughter in the dark. Those are the things that define survival more than any headline ever could. When viewed from above, that powerless ship looked tiny against the endless expanse of ocean. But on board, the human spirit filled every corridor, every deck, every heart. That's the paradox of the sea. It shrinks you and expands you at the same time. And maybe that's why stories like this stay with us. Because deep down, they're not about engines or logistics. They're about what happens when comfort fades and character takes its place. For the people who lived it, the memory of being adrift didn't end with the journey home. It became a lens through which they viewed everything afterward. A reminder that stability isn't guaranteed, but strength can be chosen. A father who was aboard with his teenage daughter said in a later interview, "When we finally reached shore, she looked at me and said, 'Dad, I'll never complain about waiting again.'" He laughed when he told the story, but his eyes showed what words couldn't: pride, perspective, and the realization that sometimes the hardest trips are the ones that teach the most. In the end, the story of that powerless ship isn't just about a breakdown in the Gulf of Mexico. It's a reminder that comfort is borrowed, not guaranteed, and that sometimes the strongest part of any voyage isn't the steel beneath your feet, but the people beside you. For 5 long days, a floating city lost its rhythm. Lights went dark, engines went silent, and time stretched into something unfamiliar. Yet within that silence, cooperation took over. Strangers became neighbors, passengers became problem solvers, and a crew trained for routine proved its worth in chaos. Every storm, mechanical or natural, reveals what can't be written in a safety manual. Patience, humor, empathy, those are the real lifeboats that keep people afloat when technology fails. When the ship finally touched the dock, the cheers weren't just for rescue. They were for relief, for resilience, for the shared knowledge that the ocean always gets the last word, but never the only one. And maybe that's why this story continues to travel farther than the ship ever did. Because being stuck at sea isn't only a tale of misfortune, it's a mirror. It shows us how thin the line is between control and surrender, between luxury and survival, between isolation and community. Out there on the open water, people discovered something no itinerary could promise: the ability to endure, to adapt, to hope, and that's what makes it more than a headline. It makes it human. So the next time you watch a cruise ship glide out of port, its decks bright and engines humming, remember this story. Behind every smooth voyage are lessons written in the wake of one that didn't go as planned. Because the sea doesn't care about schedules. It teaches, it humbles, and it always reminds us who we are when the horizon stops moving. If you found this story compelling, give it a like. It helps others discover real accounts like this one. Subscribe for more true stories of life at sea and beyond. And if you've ever faced an unexpected challenge on a trip, or anywhere, share it in the comments. Your story might just remind someone else that calm always returns after the drift. Until next time, stay curious, stay resilient, and never forget every voyage, no matter how unpredictable, carries a story worth telling.